Hello. This is the fifth and last in a series of what I call the backup videos for the lectures on the 17th, 18th, and 19th of November 2020 for the section, the module Human Rights and Human Security in the Arctic as part of the course ASPB1105, which is part of the Arctic Studies program. Like the other backup videos, this is just intended in case some of the students should not be able to attend the live lectures or the technical difficulties. Of course, these videos don't reflect the lectures perfectly, but they're intended to give you a basic idea of what we're going to cover in the lectures. The specific contents will, of course, depend on how the discussions develop during the lectures, and I hope that as many of you as possible will be active participants in the discussions. Always feel free to ask and get in touch by email or by asking during the live lectures if there should be any questions. On this last part, in our section on human rights and human security in the Arctic, I want to talk about the extractive industries and the natural environment. I already mentioned the extractive industries a couple of times in the context of indigenous rights, for example, and they are important or many communities in the Arctic want to ensure safety in terms of securing an income in areas which are very limited when it comes to income opportunities. On the other hand, is the protection of the natural environment in the Arctic a key concern for international Arctic law. Environmental issues have in fact been the starting point for the development of Arctic law in the late 80s and early 1990s. Compared to the many other parts of the world, the Arctic is relatively natural, but many people who live in the Arctic are highly dependent on a clean and healthy environment. A lot of the lifestyles in the Arctic, a lot of the food sources in the Arctic, they're very nature dependent. We need a clean environment here, maybe much more than many other parts of the world. At the same time, there are a lot of outside interests in the Arctic. There's long-distance air pollution, there are extractive industries, there's tourism, and so on. The Arctic environment, however, is also very vulnerable. Not only do we see the effects of climate change, but effects are felt much more harshly here than elsewhere. Mentioned in one of the earlier videos, the effects of oil pollution at sea, for example. The Exxon Valdez oil spill had a dramatic effect, not just on the marine environment, but also on the local economy. The incident served as a starting point for a lot of legal and policy developments, also in the context of Arctic marine environmental law, including also in the context of maritime safety. In the Arctic in particular, and this can also be seen in the context of the Polar Code, in the Arctic and Antarctica, maritime safety and the protection of the natural environment go hand in hand. They're closely related to each other. That's the same elsewhere, but in the Arctic we feel this in a particular way as the natural environment is so vulnerable here. Often, pollution in the Arctic has sources outside of the region, although admittedly often also local sources. International environmental law can provide solutions and pathways to tackle these issues. It can provide ways in which we can cooperate across borders in order to protect the Arctic environment. At the heart of international environmental law is the no-harm principle, the idea that a state is not allowed to cause harm across borders. There's an obligation, a duty to prevent significant harm to another state. For example, when permitting a specific activity in one's own territory. This transboundary environmental harm was at the core of the origin of international environmental law, especially, of course, in the Trail Smelter case between the United States and Canada. Today, this has long been recognized for over half a century already, actually, that this is part of customary international law. So it does not even have to be codified in international treaties, but the no-harm principle is now a very well-established norm of customary international law applicable to all states. In the Arctic, in particular in the European Nordic countries, we have particular treaty law developments, which move this idea of no harm forward in the direction of cross-border cooperation. The Arctic states have environmental impact assessment requirements in domestic law, for example, and parties to the Aarhus Convention. The Aarhus Convention creates legal obligations concerning environmental impact assessments, as well as the rights of the public to participate in such assessments and to have access to information. The Aarhus Convention is, for example, applicable in the Nordic countries, but unfortunately not here in Greenland. Access to information, environmental information, is crucial because it allows the local communities to play an active role in decision-making processes. The Espoo Convention, named after the Finnish city of Espoo, provides fundamental standards for environmental impact assessment and assessments, and as such is also of crucial importance for the Arctic region. It provides, for example, the framework for cross-border environmental impact assessments in the Arctic. The environmental impact assessment is part and parcel of public international law today. That was clarified already 10 years ago by the International Court of Justice in the pulp mills case, for example. Today, international law requires states to look at the consequences of their actions, including permit processes, for example. States have a duty to look beyond their own borders and to see what are the consequences of our actions beyond our borders in other countries. Already the Arctic Environment Protection Strategy, the APS, which was at the core of Arctic cooperation 30 years ago, had included environmental impact assessment standards, taking into account the specific situation in the Arctic. Today, it's the Arctic Council which is working on improving the standards for impact assessments. On a national level, the international obligation to have environmental impact assessments has been turned into norms of administrative law. So these ideas have been transferred, have been taken from the international level down to the national level and are made useful, fruitful on the local level. And this is where local communities come in. Local communities play an important role in shaping policies in the Arctic if they are heard. It's up to the states to do that. It's the obligation of states to make sure that they take into account local needs. Another important aspect of international environmental law with regard to the Arctic is the so-called precautionary approach. That too is today part of customary international law. The precautionary approach requires states not necessarily to avoid all possible risks, but it means that if there's a danger that irreversible, severe harm could be caused to the environment, then the lack of scientific certainty is not a justification for such a project. It's not justification for postponing measures which could be cost efficient and which could reduce this risk. Hence, in case of doubt, precautions have to be taken, meaning that this does not stop all projects. This does not stop everything which has some kind of impact on the environment, but that measures have to be taken to reduce the risk. This is realized, for example, in the oil spill prevention agreement by the Arctic Council to a certain degree. The Arctic Council is also working on other issues concerning the natural environment, for example, the protection of biodiversity, on the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna, for which the Arctic Council is a specific working group. Biodiversity is also protected through international law. For example, through the Convention on Biological Diversity. In the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the AquaCon guidelines have been created, which take into account, for example, sacred sites of indigenous peoples. Here you see that things come together. The environment is not something that we protect because it is the environment. Rather, it's the environment in which we as humans are living. Protecting the natural environment in the Arctic also is a form of ensuring human safety in the Arctic. It's a way of safeguarding human rights in the Arctic. Because of this close connection that we all enjoy between humans and nature in the Arctic, to certainly different degrees. But it cannot be denied that in the Arctic the dependency on nature is significant. Protecting the natural environment of the Arctic is therefore not an end in itself, but it also serves the people who live in the Arctic. Globalization and climate change make this more difficult. The Arctic is suffering from long-range air pollution, persistent organic pollutants. We have a lot of pollution forms in the Arctic which have their sources elsewhere. Think about plastic pollution in the Arctic Ocean, for example. And of course, there's climate change. Climate change remains the greatest challenge for the Arctic and for the Arctic environment. The Paris Agreement of 2015 is a step in the right direction, yet it leaves a lot to the states. Once more, we fall back to the responsibility of states and the need for states to voluntarily take action to protect the environment and fight climate change. The Arctic Council is a valuable forum in which states from the Arctic come together to discuss ways to combat climate change. Also, with regard to local sources, like black carbon, for example. All of this, the protection of the natural environment, the fight against climate change, they're important because they matter for the people who live here. International law is, first of all, aimed at relations between states. In the last half century, 70 years, basically 75 years, since the end of World War II roughly, there's a stronger focus on human rights. More recently, the environmental dimension of human rights, or rather the human rights dimension of environmental law, is recognized more and more often. International human rights law limits the sovereignty of states. The right to a healthy environment is recognized in more and more legal settings, for example, in the context of the European Convention on Human Rights, or in the Inter-American Convention system. This also has had an impact on climate change litigation. In 2015, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, for example, brought a landmark case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which was a key step forward in the development of climate change-related litigation. However, like in other fields of international law, enforcing international environmental law is notoriously difficult. Traditional methods of enforcing international law include retortions and reprisals. They don't make any sense when it comes to human rights or environmental law. The Law of the Sea Convention has different dispute settlement mechanisms, but the enforcement possibilities are still very limited. The strength of international law is not one of forcing actors to behave in a certain way, forcing states or corporations to behave in a certain way. Rather, the strength of international law is one of argument, one of persuasion. Non-binding guidelines, other forms of soft law, industry self-regulations, these are important tools. They are different from the way national legal systems often work. But soft law has an important role to play in the protection of the Arctic environment and of the people who live in the Arctic. The recent efforts, for example, by cruise ship operators in the Arctic to voluntarily refrain from using heavy fuel oils, that's an important step forward. And a good example for industry self-regulation, which actually can make a difference and can pave the way towards future forms of regulation. The issues we've been talking about so far, the issues which have been relevant in the past for the Arctic are likely to remain relevant in the future. Climate change, environmental protection, the law of the sea, indigenous rights, globalization, and sustainable development. The governance of the Arctic is fundamentally of international nature. The true effects are often seen locally, but in the Arctic, the local and the global come together. This is a space which sees a lot of change in a very short amount of time. Here in the Arctic, change is fast and dramatic for a lot of people. The role of international law in such a situation is to protect the people who live in the Arctic and to ensure peace between all actors in the Arctic. Since the end of the Cold War, the Arctic has been a zone of peace, of cooperation, and is to be hoped that this will stay so in the future, despite political differences. But it's necessary to cooperate in spaces like the Arctic or Antarctica or outer space, because here we meet challenges which individual states cannot meet on their own. One of those challenges is climate change. For the Arctic, for many communities in the Arctic, this is a life or death question. And it remains to be seen how the international community can meet this challenge and create a better future for the people who live in the Arctic. International law has a role to play in this. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the actual live lectures and hope that you enjoy the course and the entire ASP.